Hey everyone, welcome to Tactics Talk. Today we're discussing deterrence. However, we'll be focusing in on the military domain. The other domains are diplomatic, informational, and economic. So let's briefly summarize deterrence. The art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear to attack. We'll be demonstrating this in Flashpoint Campaign Southern Storm. We have a small Soviet force. They will be pushing south. Our red line is U.S. casualties. We do have a unit with a nuclear warhead down here, and that is what we'll use to deter the enemy. The next thing we need to do is we need to discuss extended deterrence as well as a nuclear armed adversary. So let's discuss extended deterrence briefly. Extended deterrence involves discouraging attacks on third parties such as allies or partners. Now, for obvious reason, extended deterrence is more challenging than direct deterrence. This is true from a military standpoint. It's more difficult to deny an attack from home, a mission that demands the projection of military force, sometimes thousands of miles away and often much closer to the territory of the aggressor state, right? So we think back to the Houthis currently launching anti-ship missiles in the Red Sea, insurgents launching drones on Iraq bases, Jordan bases, and in Syria. So the U.S. has determined that could be seen as extended deterrence, although those are direct attacks on U.S. forces. So we need to cover deterrence a bit more in depth. We also need to discuss Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. It's one of the more stringent articles, but it's also the U.S.'s commitment to extended deterrence. It does not oblige any parties to take automatic responses to an aggressor against any ally. So this can be summarized with the U.S. sacrificed New York to save France during the Cold War. Whether that's true or not, it's just a summary. So if the Soviets during the Cold War were to launch a nuclear warhead at France, would the U.S. sail across the Atlantic Ocean and conduct military operations? Here we are currently in, I believe, next to this Donau River. The Soviet forces are moving south and launching an offensive operation at the start of the war. We've determined that if the Soviets attack us, our deterrence is nuclear warheads. Although we do have chemical weapons on the battlefield, we will use those as well. Deterrence is a complex strategy. It has failed several times, and that comes basically like the vagueness. So we can see, like, if a deterrence is too vague, we see things like the Korean War or the Iraq-Kuwait War in 1990. The United States was unwilling to demonstrate autonomy for those before the fact. We can also discuss a few other things as well, which we're going to do. One thing when deterrence comes to mind is the defenders. They're constantly engaged in a tenuous balancing act, and they're trying to gauge the national interest they have at stake versus the potential contingency. So if the Soviet forces were to attack directly south and we determine that a nuclear response is necessary, it's a very tenuous balancing act. It may not be something that's necessary, but it's something that's possible. Now, we do have two other things to discuss before we dive into the scenario. General deterrence, which is the ongoing, and immediate deterrence. I'd summarize immediate deterrence as more of a short-term and an urgent attempt to prevent a specific imminent attack, right? So if we saw this attack right here as an imminent threat instead of a general threat, and we just immediately launched a ballistic missile at them, a nuclear warhead, that would be more so of immediate deterrence and less of general deterrence. Also, we can kind of take a look at the Afghanistan-Iraq War and 9/11. Those could be seen as more immediate deterrence and less general because, one, a third party directly attacked the U.S., which has been determined to be a red line. So let's give myself a quick little breathing break and hit the start menu. The Soviet forces are immediately moving south to attack the U.S. forces, which means once this turn is complete, we'll discuss our immediate response to this action. And then a third broader way of approaching deterrence is just dissuading. The goal of dissuasion is to convince the potential attacker that the cost-benefit calculus of aggression is unfavorable, partly through emphasizing the cost of aggression, but also through reassurance and the benefits of making a world without aggression more attractive. So remember, deterrence is not just threats. People generally think deterrence is a threat, but it's also assurances, and we really need to focus in on the assurances, which we're going to do next. So like, right, that's not a threat, that's a promise. Like kind of that saying when someone says, hey, if you attack our forces, we're going to launch a nuclear warhead at you. And so as the US, we need to follow through with that statement if that's what we determined our red line was. So here we have the Russian forces. Oh, they actually got a real nasty breakthrough right off the bat. So basically now we're beyond the we're beyond threats at this point. Now it's straight up time for assurances. We need to ensure that our response is met and that we just follow through on our promises. So we determined that our response to this action would be a nuclear strike. So if we come down to our nuclear warhead, we come here and we select nuclear strike. That's just telling us doesn't matter. And we say, we're in a nuclear strike your back line. You don't get tanks. Have a good time. And that's our assurance. That's our promise. They broke through. They caused several U.S. casualties. We can see, obviously, we didn't nuclear strike Iran or Iraq or even do a direct attacks on Iraq. But if we saw the aggression in Jordan, we had U.S. casualties. While we didn't have an immediate response, that is more of an immediate deterrence. So we're trying to go in there and we're just doing precision strikes on forces and ensuring they're having an overall bad time to deter future aggression. Now we're going to continue. So let's discuss deterrence a bit more. It is the perceptions of the potential aggressors that matter, not the aggressor's actual prospects for victory or the objectively measured consequences of an attack. So right, so even though we're launching a nuclear missile on this area, that's not so much what matters. It's the aggressor's actual prospects. It's not the actual prospects for victory or the objectively measured consequences of the attack. It's all about perception, right? If we said we would launch an attack or U.S. casualties were a red line and we didn't follow through on that promise, then people aren't going to take us seriously, correct? So now we have to follow through on our promise. And here it goes. Here comes our nuclear strike. All right, we're just going to continue fighting just for the fun of it. And now the U.S.'s main aggression is going to come through. We have siege strikes or bombing runs coming in, nuclear strikes, and then we're going to follow through with chemical attacks. So one major important factor that's often overlooked with deterrence is the challenger's motivation is an important factor in deterrence success or failure. How motivated is the enemy to attack the U.S.? So we take a look at the Syria-Jordan incident or the Iraq-Jordan incident. How motivated was that enemy to follow through? Were U.S. casualties their main goal? And then if they were motivated, why did they back out, right? Why did they provide the response that, hey, we're done attacking the U.S. at the point of causing U.S. casualties, right? So I don't think their overall goal at any point in time was to push right? Because now they have to deal with the U.S.'s aggression. That's a red line for the U.S. right now is U.S. casualties. Right now it's just all fun and games, like shooting missiles at the U.S. and the U.S. shooting them down. But once you get that breakthrough and you get caused 3 U.S. casualties, then the U.S. has to respond, and they're not going to respond very lightly, right? What do they say? What's the FA? Screw around, find out. That's basically at the stance we're at. And that's why a lot of people also put the thread in, like, don't mess with our ships. If the Houthis do sink a destroyer, then the U.S. response is going to ramp up. Remember, in 9/11, right, there were like 1,000 people who died. So we did divide 1,000 times, divided by 4.5 million civilian casualties or casualties over the course of the GWAT war. Basically, for every U.S. life, 700 to 1,000 people had to die. Or did die, is one way to look at it. Now, let's cover like the nuances of deterrence. And this is really important because a successful deterrence typically involves a combination of taking an aggressor's motivation seriously, being clear about whether the defender seeks to deter it, and what it will do if the threat is challenged, and taking the steps to demonstrate both the capability and determination to fulfill the threat. Right? So we say the word threat a lot and assurances quite a lot. So do we take this unit's right here, the Soviets threats, like seriously? And we didn't, But we did follow through with our threat, which was our promise, which was we will conduct a nuclear strike. So where we failed in this scenario is both immediate deterrence and general deterrence. We never accepted this unit's threat, or the USSR, Soviets, Russia's threat of assault. And since we never took it seriously, or we were too ambiguous about it, they didn't see that threat as real. So once they did that breakthrough, our diplomatic strategies broke down, our economic strategies broke down, and we had to respond militarily. So it's always important to determine if your adversary's threat is serious. Now, perceptions are everything, right? The U.S. has an amazing ability to project its force. The United States must always view situations through a lens of potential aggressors' belief and perceptions. And then preventing aggression is not strictly about making threats. It's also about offering assurances. I've said that 100 times throughout this video. We need to ensure that, or assure that our threats are real. So when they said, hey, if you cause U.S. casualties and you break through and you cross the Donau, we're going to strike you. We don't care with what weapon system, and we don't care what your motivation is at this point. Now we are at immediate deterrence, and this is direct deterrence as well. It's not so much extended. Now let's go back to discussing the 5th NATO treaty. I think I glossed over this. It's one of the more restrictive and arguably the strongest commitment of extended deterrence, but it does not oblige parties to take an automatic response to an aggressor against any ally. So we did cover that by talking about how the U.S. would respond if France was invaded or attacked. And I think, right, they took our threats seriously during the Cold War. There were obviously other Cold Wars all around, such as Vietnam, the Iran-Iraq War. Those were all part of that extended 50-year Cold War period. Even Korea could be considered one of the Cold War conflicts. Beyond all of that, deterrence is just threats and promises. And then we're going to discuss direct deterrence briefly as we conclude. Direct deterrence consists of efforts by a state to prevent attacks on its own territory, right? How many attacks on the U.S. territory have there been in the last 20 years? Beyond the Boston bombings, which could be seen as a more terroristic threat and less of a national one. 9/11, and then extended attacks like Syria, Jordan, Iran, Iraq, 20 years of GWAT, and then attacks at sea with the Houthi. So while deterrence seems like it's breaking down, it's also in full effect. So when people discuss their Iran nuclear deals, it's important to take those seriously, because once a state becomes nuclear, it becomes more emboldened. Right, you have, even not to talk about the red side. If we talk about Ukraine, or not Ukraine, UK, Britain, France, all of those are nuclear powers, and they're more emboldened to conduct conventional attacks because they do have those weapons of mass destruction. The U.S., right, it projects its power all across the globe. It invades Iraq, Afghanistan, but it also has red lines that it does not want crossed. So as China's a nuclear power, it feels emboldened to expand in the South China Sea. Russia's a nuclear power as well. They have Georgia, Syria, and they continue to expand and feel emboldened as well. And then they use these third parties to kind of conduct their diplomacy, right? Iran, mostly they'll launch ballistics at Iraq, but they do have the Houthis in Yemen, and then they have, Gaza, whoever's in Gaza. I can't, they're not the Palestinians, Hamas in Gaza. And then you have whatever organizations in Iraq now launching missiles at Syria and Jordan. So deterrence is important and deterrence is effective. So once they did cause those U.S. casualties, you can see that the U.S. was forced to respond, and the U.S. is not going to respond in kind of a passive manner. Lastly, one thing I do want to discuss in a future video is genocide briefly. I'm not sure how I'll wrap it up into a U.S. strategy or a military strategy, but I often feel like when people see U.S. responses, whether it's launching 81 precision-guided Tomahawks, or 125 precision strikes in Iraq and Syria, if the end result isn't genocide, then they always viewed that deterrence as weak, at least on the global stage, or at least on Reddit, right? So unless the U.S. goes in there and absolutely decimates an entire population, it's never viewed as a good deterring strike. Although it is, right? Because we saw that the Houthis or whoever they are in Iraq immediately respond and say they're pulling back and no longer conducting strikes, right? Although the Red Sea is still a bit of a hotbed. Anyway, just a brief video on deterrence, a brief summary, and yeah, we'll try and find some more stuff to cover later on. All right, guys, peace.